What is up, guys? In today's video, I'm going to be talking about the rocket ram and the rocket drill because Fortnite recently unvaulted the rocket ram while leaving the rocket drill in the loot pool. And a lot of people, myself included, considered the rocket drill to be a significantly better version of the rocket ram. As always, if you guys do enjoy this video, find it helpful, informative, or interesting, remember to give it a like, subscribe if you like to see more, and comment down below which of these items you think is better. And as I already said, I think the rocket drill is much better. And when it initially came out, I described it as a significantly better version of the rocket ram. There was a decent amount of comments I saw of people, saying I was faded and saying that the rocket ram is so much better. But in this video, I'm going to go over why I think the drill is better. Before we get into that, though, I want to talk about like how I evaluate a mobility item and what I care about when it comes to a mobility item. Obviously, we're at the end of season 2. It doesn't really matter that much which one of these is better because the loot pool is about to change. But how I evaluate mobility and what I care about is going to be consistent forever. So the things I care about when it comes to a mobility item and the way I evaluate it is going to be like how good this is at escaping bad situations. Especially in zero build, there's going to be times where you get caught off in a bad situation, or you're getting third partied because you fought somebody. Bad situations are going to arise, and how good a mobility item is at getting out of those bad situations or resetting a fight will go a long way in helping you remain consistent, not just get like full punished and you're game over by timing, and also allow you to play more aggressive and get in fights. So escaping and resetting fights, very important. How good they are for just traveling the map. I think this is what most people, especially newer players, kind of consider when they look at a mobility item. How good is it going from point A to point B? This isn't as important to me. It is important, but it doesn't determine the outcome of the game, I think, as much as like being able to escape fights. And then the final thing I look at, which I think is also more important than just getting to point A to point B, is how good this mobility item is for pushing players. A lot of fights in zero build kind of start with you getting initial tags on an enemy and then wanting to close the gap and push them. And when you're trying to close the gap and like get in close range and take advantage of your early shots, if you have a mobility item that leaves you very vulnerable and very susceptible to getting, counter engaged on, then it's harder for you to close kills. More people are going to get away from you. And then, that's probably going to result in you losing more fights. Like being able to get damage and take advantage of that damage is very important. So those are the three things that matter most to me. How good it is at escaping, how good is it at pushing enemies, and then how good is it for traveling around the map? And all the mobility items, or several of the mobility items that we have in the loot pool right now, are good at like 2 of these, and then maybe not as good at 1 of the other. So like shockwaves, for example, these are great for escaping and resetting fights because you just throw it down and you're out of there. And how much your character moves is a good amount for a single mobility item. It's harder to like beam. You certainly can get AR'd when using shockwaves, but it's a bit harder for people to track than something like, the bat or like the grapple glove when we had that in loot pool. It's a very just immediate, significant change in your character's position. And so it's very good for escaping. Because of that, it's also very good for pushing enemies. If you want to get tags on somebody and then shock onto them, you don't give them very much time to respond. You don't give them very much time to heal. And you're able to take advantage of that damage, and you're able to take advantage of that pressure to, close that kill out very quickly. However, they're not very good at just traveling the map because you'll quickly run out. You can only hold 6 shockwaves in a single inventory slot. So if you're trying to use this just to go from like point A to point B, it's not very efficient at that, and you'd be better off using another item for that, right? The bat is great for just general travel because it just goes off your sprint and it has a lot of charge for that. And using like the sprint and the slide, you can get a lot of stamina and have a lot of travel time with the bat. But it's not the greatest at like escaping a terrible situation. It's not good at like overcoming terrain disadvantages. If you need to like get up a hill or off a like something like that, it's not very good for that. You're just using your general sprint. There is the jump, but anybody decent is going to be able to easily fry you when you're just running out in the open with the bat. And then because of that, it's also not the greatest at pushing enemies. It can be, but it really depends on like the terrain and the cover you have. If there's a good amount of cover between you and the enemy and you can kind of use that as you sprint on them with the bat, then it'll work. But if it's mostly open field between you and the enemy and you're just running at them with the bat, you're opening yourself up to getting that fight turned super easily. And then finally, the one I want to talk about is going to be the Rift Launcher. This is obviously great for escaping enemies because you just shoot the rift and then you're out of there. You can get shot out of the air, but not everybody is the greatest at that. And then it's also really good for just general travel because it's unlimited. It recharges over time, and you can get a lot of movement out of a single rift. However, the Rift Launcher is really not the greatest at pushing people unless they're very far away. Then it kind of works out well. But if somebody's like medium range, like let's say there's like 40 meters away from you, rifting on them is just going to take so long, and you leave yourself very vulnerable while you're trying to land on them with your glider. You're kind of defenseless. So like I don't think the Rift Launcher is that great at actually just like pushing an enemy after you've gotten those initial tags. So it's only good at like 2 of the 3, or only like exceptional at 2 of the 3, right? And that's kind of how I evaluated all of these items. When comparing the rocket drill and the rocket ram, we'll get to them in a bit, but like the rocket drill, I think, is kind of mid at everything. It's not the greatest at, you know, escaping a bad situation. It can kind of work depending on the terrain, especially if you're in an area with like trees and somebody you can get above it and stuff. It's the best at kind of getting away from fall damage, but it's also not the greatest at pushing people. It really depends on the terrain. If you're just driving straight at them with the rocket drill, then you're very susceptible to getting beamed. It is good at just traveling around the map. It has a decent amount of fuel. You get a decent amount of uses with it. The cooldown time on it isn't that significant. And it's really good at like getting around bad terrain. If you need to get up a mountain with the drill or up any sort of high ground, it works decently well for that. But it's not the greatest at pushing or escaping bad situations. The rocket ram, however, I think is good at nothing. Like it isn't the best at getting out of a bad situation. It's not the best at, you know, moving around the map. And it's also not the greatest at pushing enemies because of how long it takes. And we'll get into why in a moment. So like the reasons why I think the drill was just kind of like 7 out of 10 at everything and the ram is terrible is because, for one, the rocket ram has a much longer delay to actually start being used than the rocket drill. Both of these items have somewhat of a delay or like a use time. And that makes it hard for escaping bad situations or using your mobility in like a snap instant. But how long the delay is on the rocket ram leaves you very vulnerable to getting fried. If you're already taking damage and you need to get out of there, you're probably going to die before you get it off. The rocket ram also locks you into an animation that is somewhat predictable, whereas the drill, you can use it in short bursts if needed. And this can make you very hard to deal with. I'll have a clip on screen now where this final player was very elusive with the rocket drill. He wasn't really able to create much separation and actually reset the fight, but this fight took so much more longer for me to actually eliminate him when he's using the drill here, and because he's using it in these short bursts, than if he was using the rocket ram. If he uses the ram, he's just dead immediately. The rocket ram also has a 25-second cooldown after being used, and this makes it much worse at just general travel. Like you don't get that far off a single rocket ram use, but the fact that it has a 25-second cooldown between being able to be used again makes it very just meh at traveling around the map. And these cooldowns make your mobility item less viable in like situations where you need them. If you just used it to travel and then it's on cooldown and then you need it again to like push somebody or get away from something, it's not the greatest at that anyways. But the fact that it has this long cooldown is really bad, and it also only has 10 uses. So you have an item that isn't great to begin with. It has a long cooldown and it only has 10 uses. Like it's just incredibly limited compared to the drill and the other mobility items. It also shows on visual audio where the drill doesn't, which is going to make it a bit harder to escape situations and maybe get lost by the enemy. And it's also going to make it worse for like engaging on people and catching them off guard. Both of these items do leave the user pretty exposed, and I kind of talked about that a moment ago where I said the drill isn't the greatest for just like straight up pushing anyways. But since the drill has less delay and you do have more control over how you travel and how long you use it, I think you have more control or more like counterplay, I guess, in situations where the enemy is trying to fry you. One of the only advantages the rocket ram has over the rocket drill is that if you land on somebody, you can kind of cause them damage and maybe stun them and knock them back a bit. But this isn't something that I think really works versus anybody who's decent, especially in zero build. In build mode, in Chapter 4, Season 4, this item was used a good amount in FNCS. But FNCS is a very different game because of how congested every layer is with how many people are left alive in building. the fact that the rocket ram could like break through builds and then just land on height was decent. But that's not a situation that really ever occurs in public matches. And so I don't really see much value in it. When you're getting a vault, I've seen people say that the rocket ram one-shots the vault, which if it did, would actually be incredible. But what it does is it does a lot of damage to one of the red pieces of the vault. So if you were on the final red piece, I guess you could break that one and then you would get in. But it's not like you're going to pull up on like a vault, start the interaction, and then just break the first red piece and just break in. Like you just break one of them. And because of that 25-second cooldown, that actually makes it terrible at getting the vaults because you only break one of the red pieces, whereas the rocket drill does a great job of just grinding the pieces down and damaging them very quickly. Not much of a cooldown on that, and you're not using a significant amount of its durability. So if I was getting a vault, I would still much rather have the drill. I think, in summary, I hope that this video kind of made sense to you, but like the ram does everything poorly, whereas the drill does everything about average or slightly above average, and also is a great counter to fall damage. The ram could also counter fall damage, but because the animation is quite long, I think if you didn't fully use it before you hit the ground, then you actually would be susceptible to taking fall damage. So I think the ram is just worse at pretty much everything than the rocket drill, and I see pretty much no reason to use it. And that's kind of how I felt about it in Chapter 4, Season 4, when it initially came out as well. I've never been very high on this item, and I think pretty much anybody in the comment section who has decent aim will tell you that it is incredibly easy to beam opponents using this, and it's one of my favorite mobility items ever to play against because it really just creates an opportunity for free kills. But that is going to be it for this video. I hope you found this helpful, informative, and interesting. I kind of wanted to talk about how I evaluate mobility items on top of just comparing these items because, you know, the season is about to end anyways, so it's not the biggest deal one way or the other, but how I think about mobility items is something that can help you going forward. If you enjoyed this, give it a like, subscribe if you'd like to see more, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.